In the forests east of Detroit, something began peeling the bark from the ash trees. Not wind, not disease. From a distance, the trunks looked scarred and pale, almost bleached, as if the woods had turned gray overnight. Beneath that bark, a war was being fought that no one had ordered and no one was paying for. America was about to spend a fortune trying to win it, and the creature that actually answered the call would never send a bill. To understand the pale trees, you have to go back to the summer of 2002 to a stand of ash on the western edge of Detroit, Michigan. A few homeowners noticed that the crowns of their trees were thinning. The leaves at the top came out sparse, then yellow, then not at all. Branches died back from the tips inward. And when someone finally cut into a struggling tree and lifted away a piece of the bark, they found the answer written into the wood itself. Tunnels, hundreds of them. Narrow, winding galleries packed with sawdust, curling under the bark in long looping S shapes, as if something had been writing in a language no one could read. At the end of one of those tunnels sat the writer, a beetle. Smaller than a grain of rice when it began its life, metallic green as polished glass, with a body that caught the light like a chip of emerald. It had a name now, though almost no one in North America had ever heard it. The emerald ash borer. A wood boring beetle from the forests of northeastern Asia, from China and Korea and the Russian Far East, where it had lived quietly for millions of years among ash trees that knew how to fight it. It was not supposed to be in Michigan. It had almost certainly arrived years earlier, sometime in the 1990s, stowed away inside wooden shipping crates and pallets, riding the global trade in goods across an entire ocean and into the heart of the continent. By the time anyone found it, it had a head start of a decade, and it had found paradise. Because North America was an ocean of ash. 16 native species of ash trees grew across the continent, from the white ash of the eastern hardwood forests to the green ash that lined the streets of 1,000 towns, to the black ash that grew in the cold, wet swamps of the north. After Dutch elm disease had swept away the American elm decades before, cities had replanted, and over they had reached for ash. It grew fast. It grew straight. It threw a wide, generous shade across sidewalks and backyards and schoolyards. In some neighborhoods, ash made up 6 trees out of every 10. The beetle had crossed an ocean and woken up inside an endless buffet, surrounded by trees that had never met it and had no idea how to survive it. To understand why a beetle the size of a fingernail could level a forest, you have to understand what it does and where it does it. Because the danger was never the adult. The adult beetle is almost harmless. It nibbles a little ash foliage in the summer sun, it mates, and the female lays her eggs in the cracks and crevices of the bark. The eggs are tiny, tucked into the rough furrows of the trunk where nothing can see them. And then the eggs hatch, and the real story begins in the one place no one ever looks. Inside the tree. The larva that hatches is a pale, flattened, segmented grub, and the moment it emerges, it chews its way straight through the bark and into the living tissue beneath. And that living tissue is everything. Just under the bark of every tree runs a thin layer called the phloem, the vascular system, the plumbing. It is the channel that carries sugar made in the leaves down to feed the roots, and it works alongside the flow that lifts water and nutrients up from the roots to the crown. It is the bloodstream of the tree, and the larva eats it. It tunnels sideways and around, carving those long winding galleries through the phloem, and with every centimeter it severs another set of the tree's supply lines. One larva does little, but there are never just one. A single heavily infested tree can hold tens of thousands of larvae, and as their tunnels cross and multiply, they slowly strangle the tree from the inside, wringing it, cutting the crown off from the roots. The leaves at the top starve first. That is the thinning canopy. That is the dieback. By the time a homeowner notices the bare branches against the sky, the tree has already been dying in silence for 2 or 3 years. Most ash, once infested, are dead within 3 to 5. When the grub has eaten its fill, it carves a little chamber, folds itself into a J-shaped position, and waits out the winter. In spring, it transforms, and the new adult beetle chews its way out through the bark and flies off to find the next tree, leaving behind a tiny, perfect, capital D-shaped exit hole. Those D-shaped holes became the signature of the catastrophe. Foresters learned to read a stand of ash like a crime scene. The S-shaped tunnels underneath, the D-shaped holes on the surface, the gray, dying crown above. And the beetle was a strong flyer, able to move kilometers on its own, but its real speed came from us. From firewood, from nursery stock, from people loading infested logs into a truck and driving them across a state line in a single afternoon, carrying the beetle hundreds of kilometers in a day to a fresh forest that had never been touched. And so it spread, and it kept spreading, in every direction, year after year, out of Michigan into Ohio and Indiana, across the Mississippi, down into the south, up into New England, west toward the Rockies. As of today, the emerald ash borer has been confirmed in 38 states and the District of Columbia, and across the border deep into Canada. The number of ash trees it has killed is no longer counted in millions. It is counted in the hundreds of millions. Entire species are now at risk of being functionally erased from the continent. In some northern wetlands, the black ash that holds the very soil and water table in place is vanishing, and with it a tree that indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee, have used for generations for weaving and basketry and ceremony, a living thread of culture being pulled out of the forest one tree at a time. This was no longer an insect problem. It was an economic emergency. The ash trees standing in American towns and cities were not just trees, they were infrastructure. They cooled the streets, they raised the property values, they soaked up the stormwater, they cleaned the air. When researchers tried to put a single number on the urban ash of the United States, the compensatory value, the cost to replace what those trees actually do for us, they arrived at a figure of around $282 billion. A forest hidden inside the cities, worth more than almost anyone had ever realized, and all of it suddenly under a death sentence. So America went to war. Towns inventoried their ash, tree by tree, and faced an impossible bill. You could try to save a tree by injecting it with insecticide, but the treatment cost money and had to be repeated every couple of years, for the rest of the tree's life, forever. Or you could cut the tree down before it died and fell on a house or a power line, and pay to haul it away, and pay again to plant something new in its place. Quarantines went up to stop the movement of firewood. Crews moved street by street through neighborhoods that had been green for 50 years, taking the canopy down to stumps. And the cost climbed into numbers that are hard to hold in your head. The most careful study of that bill, led by the economist Kent Kovacs and his colleagues, projected the cost of treating, removing, and replacing ash trees in American communities across 25 states over a single decade at more than $10.5 billion. And that was a conservative slice of it. Reach beyond the towns, fold in the private land and the lost trees and the years of spraying and the endless replanting, and the true bill for fighting this one beetle runs higher still into the range of $12, even $13 billion. $12.5 billion poured into chainsaws and chemicals and stump grinders and quarantine signs. And here is the hardest part to say out loud. After all of it, the beetle kept spreading. The money slowed it. The money bought time. But the money did not stop it. By every honest measure, the most expensive insect invasion in the history of North America was being lost. To understand what came back, you first have to understand what was lost. Walk into one of the forests where the beetle arrived early, 10 or 15 years ago, and at first it looks like a graveyard. The ash are skeletons. Bare gray trunks stand against the sky with no leaves at all, their bark falling away in sheets, their crowns reduced to broken antlers. The shade is gone. Sunlight pours down onto a forest floor that spent a century in cool green twilight. Standing among those dead giants it would be easy to believe the story was over, that this was simply the end, that the beetle had won, and the forest had nothing left to answer with. But if you stand in that ruined forest in the cold months, in the bare quiet of winter, and you stop, and you listen, you will hear it. A sharp, hard, rhythmic knocking echoing through the dead stand. Then another, from a different direction. Then another. The forest that looks like a graveyard is not silent at all. It is loud with work. And if you look up at the pale trunks, you finally understand what was peeling the bark. You see the bright patches where the rough gray outer bark has been chipped and flaked away to expose the smooth light wood underneath, pale gold against the gray, scattered up and down the trunks like blazes on a trail. Foresters have a name for it. They call it blonding, and it is not damage. It is the signature of the rescue. The blonding is the work of woodpeckers. Because while the human war was being fought with budgets and chainsaws, something else had noticed the beetle. Something that did not need a meeting, or a grant, or a plan. The native birds of the North American forest had discovered that the trees were suddenly full of food. Think about it from a woodpecker's point of view. For the price of a little chiseling, the dying ash offered a feast. Under the bark of a single heavily infested tree, there could be 60,000 or more fat, protein-rich beetle larvae sitting still, waiting out the winter in their little chambers, unable to run and unable to fly. To a downy woodpecker, to a hairy woodpecker, to a red-bellied woodpecker, to a white-breasted nuthatch creeping headfirst down the trunk, this was not a catastrophe. It was the richest hunting they had ever known, and they came to it. The first person to prove what was happening was the ornithologist Walter Koenig, working with the Forest Service scientist Andrew Liebhold and their colleagues. They had a tool no one had ever had before. For years, ordinary people across North America had been counting the birds at their backyard feeders for a citizen science project called Project Feeder Watch, run out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Thousands of volunteers, year after year, quietly writing down which birds came to their gardens. That ocean of data meant that scientists could look back in time and watch what happened to the birds in the exact place and the exact years the beetle arrived. They focused on the region around Detroit, the very ground where the invasion began. And in 2013, they published what they found. The birds were booming. In the heart of the invasion, as the beetle spread and the ash began to die, the numbers of red-bellied woodpeckers and white-breasted nuthatches climbed. The downy and hairy woodpeckers wobbled at first, dipping before they rose, but they too pushed upward in the years that followed. A later study, tracking a full decade across a much wider region, found the same fingerprint again. Strongest in the depths of winter, exactly when the larvae are locked under the bark and the birds need them most, and growing stronger as the invasion rolled on. The catastrophe that was killing the ash was feeding the birds. One scientist summed up the whole strange story in a single line. It was a disaster for the ash, and a feast for the woodpeckers. But a population going up is one thing. The real question was sharper. Were the birds actually killing enough beetles to matter? Or were they just along for the ride, fattening up on a disaster they could not change? For that answer, go to Central Ohio, to the work of the biologist Charles Flower and his colleagues. They wanted to know not just whether the birds were there, but what they were doing. So they watched the foraging tree by tree, and then they did the hard, patient thing. They took infested ash trees apart, piece by piece, and they counted. They counted the larvae the birds had eaten, and the larvae the birds had missed. And the numbers were extraordinary. In the most heavily worked trees, the bark foraging birds had wiped out as much as 85% of the beetle larvae inside. Other studies in Michigan and Ohio found predation reaching 95% on individual trees. Across all the trees, the average run of destruction was lower, somewhere around a third to a half of the larvae in an infested tree. But think about what that means at the scale of a forest. A free workforce, arriving on its own, removing on average somewhere between 40 and 95% of an invading army that humans were spending billions to fight. And then they found the most beautiful detail of all. The birds were not hunting at random. They were smart. The woodpeckers and nuthatches preferred the ash trees over other kinds of trees, and among the ash, they zeroed in on the ones with thinning, declining crowns, the trees that were sickest, the trees that held the most beetles. They were reading the canopy. They had learned that a dying crown meant a trunk packed with food, and they spent their effort where the hunting was richest, harvesting far more heavily from the heavily infested trees than from the healthy ones. The denser the beetle, the harder the birds hit it. It is the exact behavior you would design into a perfect natural control, a predator that automatically pours its strength into the worst outbreaks. And no one had to design it at all. It simply emerged, out of hungry birds and an open opportunity. To be certain it was really the birds, scientists ran the cleanest test there is. Led by the researcher Jenny Jennings, they wrapped sections of infested ash trunks in screening, fencing the woodpeckers out of some patches of bark while leaving the rest open. Then they peeled the trees and counted who was still alive. Where the woodpeckers had been locked out, almost all of the larvae survived, more than 9 in 10. Where the woodpeckers had been allowed in, a third of the larvae were simply gone. Same trees, same beetles. The only difference was whether the birds could reach them. That is as close to proof as field ecology ever gets. The woodpecker is, to this day, the single largest source of death for the emerald ash borer anywhere in North America. Now, honesty matters, and this is where the simple story has to grow up into a truer and, in the end, a more hopeful one. Because the woodpeckers did not save every tree, and it is important to understand why. The birds feed mostly in fall and winter, and they go hardest after the big, late-stage larvae. But by the time a larva is big and late stage, it has already done its damage. It has already eaten its winding tunnel through the phloem. So for the individual tree, often already wounded, the woodpecker arrives a little too late to be a cure. The birds also play favorites. They will hammer one infested ash relentlessly and almost ignore the dying tree right next to it. A woodpecker is a hunter, not a forester. It is not trying to save the woods. It is trying to feed its family through the winter. And yet, look at what that hunting does to the beetle itself. Every larva a woodpecker pulls out of the bark in January is a beetle that will not fly in June. It is an egg that will never be laid, a tunnel that will never be carved, a tree downwind that will never be infected. The birds were not saving the individual sick tree. They were doing something larger and slower and more important. They were grinding down the beetles' numbers across the whole forest, generation after generation, for free, all winter, every winter, year after year, while the chainsaws were busy somewhere else and the bill kept climbing. And the woodpeckers were not working alone. Because nature, it turned out, was quietly assembling an entire defense, and the woodpeckers were only the front line. Look very closely at the bark of an infested ash in early summer, and you might catch a flicker of black and red. A wasp. Slender, only a few millimeters long, jet black across the head and the body with a vivid red abdomen, and trailing behind her, a long needle-thin tube. She is a native North American insect, a parasitoid wasp, and one of the first of her kind to be properly described from this invasion was given the name Atanicolus capaerti. She cannot sting you. That long tube is not a stinger. It is an ovipositor, a drill, and she uses it for one purpose. She can sense the beetle larva chewing under the bark, line herself up over its hidden tunnel, drive that drill straight down through the wood, and lay her egg directly onto the body of the grub. Her own young hatch outside the larva and feed on it alive, killing the beetle where humans cannot even see it. In some Michigan forests, native wasps like her were found parasitizing as much as 70% of the beetle larvae in a stand. The forest had its own assassins, and they were learning the new prey. And then humans, after years of careful testing, did the one genuinely clever thing in the whole campaign. They went back to the beetle's homeland in Asia and brought home its ancient enemies. Tiny, stingless wasps, no threat to anyone, that had hunted the emerald ash borer in China and the Russian Far East for millions of years. Wasps with names like Tetrasticus and Ubius and Spathius. They were released into the American forests by the millions to find the beetle, to lay their eggs in its eggs and its larvae, and to do across the continent what they had always done at home. Slowly, patiently, they began to establish. And researchers tracking them now see the thing they hoped for most. The wasps are protecting the young trees, the next generation of ash. So the picture filled in. Woodpeckers from above, hammering the larvae through the winter, native wasps and imported wasps from within, drilling into the survivors. A whole free army, feathered and winged, closing in on the beetle from every direction at once. And here, at last, is where the dead grey forest answers back. Because if you go back to those oldest infested sites, the places that looked like graveyards 15 years ago, and you walk in slowly and you look down, you will see it. Green. Rising out of the leaf litter, in the new sunlight pouring through the gaps the dead giants left behind, are young ash, seedlings, saplings, knee-high, then waist-high, then taller. The old trees, before they died, threw down seed, and that seed is sprouting into a forest the beetle largely cannot touch. Because the emerald ash borer needs a trunk of a certain size, a tree at least 6 to 8 inches across, before it can really move in and breed. The young saplings are too small to be worth attacking. And in those old forests, the beetle's own outbreak has crashed. Once the big ash were gone, the food was gone, and the beetle population collapsed back down towards something small, hunted now on every side by the birds and the wasps it left behind, which gives the saplings a window. A chance to grow up in a forest where the enemy is a shadow of what it was. And among those survivors, scientists keep finding something rarer and more wonderful still. Here and there, scattered through the devastation, stand a few full-grown ash that simply did not die. Healthy, green-crowned, alive, in the middle of a stand where everything else of their kind is bone. Researchers call them the lingering ash, and they are not lucky. They are resistant. When scientists study these survivors, they find that some of them can actually fight the beetle. When a larva tries to tunnel in, the tree walls it off, building a barrier around the intruder faster than it can chew, sealing it into a tiny prison where it starves before it can do real harm. Other lingering ash seem to have gone quiet in a different way, missing certain chemical scents that the beetle uses to find its target, so that the hunting beetle flies right past them, unable to smell a tree that is standing in plain sight. These trees carry, written into their genes, the beginnings of an answer. And this is where the human effort finally finds its redemption, not in the chainsaws, but in the greenhouses. Conservationists have begun to hunt for the lingering ash. At places like the Cornell Botanic Gardens, working with partners across a national project to rescue trees in peril, teams led by people like the Natural Areas Director Todd Bittner are seeking out these resistant survivors, taking cuttings, grafting them, and raising their children by the hundreds. Already, more than 100 grafted saplings, grown from more than 26 different resistant parent trees, have been planted out into living banks, each one carrying its parent's gift for survival. The idea is breathtakingly simple and breathtakingly long. Gather the trees that the beetle could not kill, breed them, multiply them, and one day give the forest back its ash, a new ash, one that remembers how to fight. So look again at that pale, blonded trunk in the winter woods and understand what you are really seeing. You are not looking at the end of the ash, you are looking at the moment. A continent's wild defenses woke up. The story did not go the way the budgets imagined. Humans spent more than $12 billion trying to hold back a green beetle the size of a fingernail. And for all that money, the beetle still spread to 38 states. But while the invoices piled up, the forest was quietly building a rescue that no one funded and no one commanded. A red-bellied woodpecker drumming on a dead trunk in January. A black and red wasp drilling into the bark in June. a single lingering ash standing green and stubborn in a field of skeletons. A carpet of young saplings rising into the new light. None of them ever sent a bill. None of them ever asked for thanks. They simply did the work, because the work was their life. We tend to imagine that nature is fragile, that it waits helplessly for us to save it. But that is not what the ash forests teach. They teach that the wild world is not a museum to be guarded. It is a system, ancient and inventive and relentless, that has been answering catastrophes for hundreds of millions of years, and was answering this one long before we noticed and long after we ran out of money. Our greatest contribution in the end may not be to fight nature's battles for it. It may be far humbler than that, to leave the dead trees standing for the woodpeckers to work, to plant the survivors, to protect the wasps, to step back and trust the forest to do what it has always done, to get out of the way and let the wild defenders win. The ash trees are not gone. Listen on a cold, still morning at the edge of any eastern wood, and somewhere out among the gray trunks, you will hear it. That sharp, patient, rhythmic knocking. The sound of a forest healing itself for free.